Does anybody else have that testimony that God has made a way for you? Made a way out of nowhere. I don't know how. I don't know why, but you just keep on making a way. You made a way when my back was against the wall and it looked as if it was over. You made a way, and we're standing here only because you made a way. Standing here, not knowing how we'll get through this test, but holding on to faith, you know best. Nothing can catch you by surprise. You've got this figured out. You're watching us now.
And when it looks as if we can't win, you wrap us in your arms and step in. And everything we need you supply. You've got this in control, and now we know that you made a way.
When our backs were
against the wall,
and
it looked as if it was over.
Yeah, you
made a way,
and we're standing
here
only because
you.
Can we sing it again? Say you made a way when our backs were
against the wall,
and
it looked as if it was over.
Say you, yeah,
made a way,
and we're standing
here only because you made a way.
Hey, if you know the song, come on, sing it out right here. You move mountains, you cause walls to fall with your power. Oh, miracles, there is nothing, yeah, that's impossible. And we're standing here only because come on, you move
mountains,
you cause walls
to fall
with your
power.
perform miracles. Yeah.
Miracles.
There is nothing
Impossible.
and we're standing here
Only because
you made a way.
and we're standing
Right here and right now.
you made a way.
And we're standing here only because you made a way. You made a way. You made
a way.
Hey, you made
a way.
Hey, yeah.
Made a
Don't know how.
Don't know how, but you did it.
Yeah, made a. Don't know how.
Don't know how, but you did it.
Yeah.
Made a
Don't know how.
Don't know how, but you
Don't
did
know
it.
how, but you did. Don't know how, but you did. Don't know how, but you did it. And I don't know why.
Don't know why, but I'm grateful.
Yeah.
Don't know why,
I
but I'm
don't know
grateful.
why, but I'm
Don't know
grateful.
why, but I'm
Yes, Lord, I'm
grateful.
thankful
Don't know why,
that
but
you
I'm grateful.
have mercy on me. Hey, that you thought about me. Yeah, you're so mindful of me, Lord. Yeah, I don't know why. Hey, And I'm standing here only because you made a way.
Hey, family, friends of EBC, thank you so much for being a part of our online Bible study. And of course, as you know, we're in this series as it relates to understanding the office of a bishop in the Lord's church. I want to thank you for availing yourself and even beyond that, being open in heart and mind to receive even this particular series of lessons. And so today we have Bishop Jerry Hutchins with us, who's going to help us to understand the whole aspect of the accountability as it relates to serving as a bishop in the Lord's church. We recognize that God honors us when we live, and not just live, but when we lead with accountability. And so he's going to help to impart information and even knowledge to us as it relates to this whole aspect of serving as a bishop in the Lord's church. So I pray that you will be open in heart and mind as you will receive even now Bishop Jerry Hutchins.
Well, greetings to all of you, and we thank God for this opportunity to come and share tonight. And we're grateful for what the Lord has done and what he's now doing. And we are honored tonight that Bishop Designate Craig Oliver, your pastor, your leader, has invited us to come and to share with the Elizabeth Church. We, of course, salute Lady Oliver as well as Bishop Designate Oliver and all of you. Thank you for allowing me this opportunity to share. I've been invited mainly to speak to the Elizabeth Church regarding your pastor as he becomes a bishop in the Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship. We, of course, congratulate him, and we congratulate you as a church body that you are now being also elevated, because whenever the leader is elevated, then so are the people. Let me first of all say that that even though Craig L. Oliver Sr. is being consecrated as a bishop in the Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship, he yet remains the pastor of the Elizabeth Church. He's still your pastor. Nothing changes as it relates to that. Some of you will easily shift to calling him Bishop Oliver. Others of you, because of your tenure, because of your relationship, because you've been with him for so long, you may still desire to call him Pastor Oliver. There is nothing wrong with either of those terminologies, to call him pastor or to call him bishop. Neither title is wrong to use. Now, to the Universal Church, he is Bishop Craig L. Oliver. But to you as a church body, as a church family, he remains your pastor, regardless of what you call him. He is your pastor and will be your pastor. Now, because the Full Gospel Baptist Church is a fellowship, Full Gospel Baptist Church fellowship, it is not a denomination. There is no mandate that churches that become a part of Full Gospel, there is no mandate that they change their name to be Elizabeth Full Gospel Baptist Church. We're not a denomination. We're not the Full Gospel Baptist Church denomination. We are the Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship. Elizabeth remains an autonomous, independent church. You will listen to some instruction by my co-teacher, Bishop Luter, as he will address and has addressed that the church remains independent and autonomous. The government of this church remains as it has been. Full Gospel Baptist Church is a fellowship of independent churches. Now, naturally, when we first began, we were a fellowship of independent Baptist churches. But over time, we've brought in people that were not of the Baptist church, but yet we remain Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship. That being said, the fellowship assumes no ownership in the individual local church. We have no direct authority in the local church. Bishop Luter will address how there are two types of episcopal structures, episcopal governance in the church. And on your screen, you'll see that I will be able to give you some definitions of the connectional church and the congregational church. The connectional church are those whose governance emphasizes essential interdependence through fellowship, consultation, government, and oversight. The traditional United Methodist Church defines connection as the principle that all leaders and congregations are connected in a network of loyalties and commitments that support yet supersede local concerns. Now, Full Gospel is not a connectional church. Our churches are congregational churches. And congregational church are those whose governance rests in the individual congregation. As I've already said, Elizabeth remains a congregational church, and its governance remains within that local body. I want to talk for a few minutes about how bishops came to be in the first place and what their role is. I think this is an important part of what we do as we train bishops, as we talk to churches that become a part of our fellowship, because up until 1993, the Baptist Church really did not freely use the title of bishops. Bishop Paul Sylvester Morton, our founder, he organized the Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship. And since then, there have been hundreds of persons that have been consecrated as bishops through this Reformation. Other reformations outside of the Methodist and Pentecostal denominations have since embraced the episcopal office, because now we have reformations that are Baptist, we have reformations that are Methodist or whatever, but they tend to embrace this usage of the term bishops. Now, while some churches have educated their pew relative to this sacred office, there have been some who failed to do so. And that's one of the things that I want to applaud your pastor, your soon-to-be bishop. I want to applaud him and the Elizabeth Church for seeing the need to come in and provide some instruction, some teaching to the pew as to what does it mean for my pastor to now become a bishop. And I will do all that I can, along with my co-teacher, to give some explanation to some terms as relates to this whole office. I'm going to explain how the early Christian church was developed and what apostles and pastors and bishops, those particular titles that I want to address, what were their roles and how that they connect to each other. The slide that you will see will give you the English term as apostles, pastors, and bishops. And then it will also give you the Greek term as apostolos, poimen, and episcopos. Now, it has been erroneously taught that there is no difference between a bishop and a pastor. That is not true. There is a difference. Now, that does not mean that one person cannot be both. However, there is a difference in a bishop and a pastor, or a poimen, as the Greek word there is before you. When we understand the history of the bishop, then we're able to address and correct that fallacy of there not being any difference between those functions and those titles. In the early formation of the Christian church, the apostles, the apostolos, they would go into different areas and they started churches in houses. The house church was the way the church was established. And people would go to these houses or to these homes, and they will be taught about Christ. They did not have any written New Testament like we have now. They did use the Septuagint. But most of what the apostles did was that they came into agreement of the teachings of Christ, and they developed what was called the apostles' doctrine. Even in Acts chapter 2 and verse number 42, it helps us to know that the people continued in the apostles' doctrine. Acts 2 and 46 even mentions that they continued daily with one accord from house to house, and they followed again the apostles' doctrine. Now, the apostles had pretty much agreed on what should be taught to the church, what should be taught in these individual houses. They specifically agreed on what should be taught regarding this guy who had been born of a virgin, this guy who had been crucified, this guy who had been risen, this guy who is now ascended and is seated at the right hand of the Father. They agreed, the apostles agreed on what they would teach regarding him. Now, these houses, as the apostles developed their doctrines, these houses naturally grew to be more than just one house in one little area, but they grew to be several houses. And as these houses became more houses, it created a need for the apostles to have more help as it related to teaching the apostles' doctrine. As these house churches grew, the apostles needed help to teach, and the work grew beyond what the apostles could do. So the apostles would name someone to be the lead teacher in a house. He was the lead shepherd of that house. And this person, again, was called the poimen. It's spelled P-O-I-M-E-N, as you see on your screen. He was a poimen. Our English Bible translates poimen as pastors. And it may surprise many of us that as much as we hear that term pastors used in our local churches today, that word pastor, whether it's singular or plural, is only used one time in all of the New Testament. There's only one mention in all of the New Testament about pastors, and that is in Ephesians chapter number 4 and verse number 11. But each house would have a poimen, a pastor, and their role was to serve as the presiding officer, to serve as the manager, to serve as the director, to serve as the shepherd of that house. He would be assigned to a house, and he was the shepherd of that house, and he only could teach the apostles' doctrine. He received his teaching. The apostles got theirs from Christ. The apostle would now teach the poimen. The poimen would teach the people. Now, the teaching house was called the ecclesia, or the assembly. And as time grew, as I said already, houses grew and more poimens were added. It then got to a point where the apostles could not handle all the poimens. The poimens outgrew the ability of the apostles to properly teach all the poimens and maintain the order that was necessary in those individual houses. So then the poor mains, because there are so many of them now, unfortunately, they began to have their own opinions about what should be taught in their house. They started to take ownership of the house. This is my house. I teach what I want to teach in my house. And they began to abandon the apostles' doctrine. But in order to bring some unity and some consistency back to each house, the apostles would go into the houses, and they would, from a pool of poor mains, they would choose someone to oversee, episcopos, all of the houses. So, one poor main pastor will be chosen from a pool of poor mains, and that poor main became what we now know as bishops. He was the episcopos. His office was called the episcopacy, but as an individual, he was called the episcopos, the overseer. Epi, meaning over, scope, meaning to see. He was to oversee all the houses, all the poor mains. And that was only done as a consequence of poor mains starting to develop their own teaching, their own doctrines, their own instructions, to start lay claim that this is my house. And so the apostles had to bring some order to the chaos. And that chaos was brought to order by naming episcopos, bishops that will oversee a jurisdiction of houses. So the apostles would name overseers, episcopos, bishops, and their function was to oversee the teaching and leadership of the poor main. The poor main was subject to the instructions of the episcopacy, the episcopos, the bishop. Now, heresies and false teachings were rampant. They were as rampant then as they are now. In fact, some of the same heresies and false teachings that they face, we still face. But many times we face them as if though it is some new type of heresy, some new type of false teaching. But much of this stuff just comes from something that was taught back then, and it was declared heresy then, and in many cases, the one who taught it was excommunicated, put out of the church, and told, do not teach that doctrine anymore. And that would be done by the episcopos, to say to that poor main, do not teach that heresy anymore. So that's why the early church had bishops and pastors. They're not the same, because the pastor was the shepherd of the local house. The bishop became the overseer of several houses and controlled, as much as he could, the teachings of that house, as they were obligated to follow the apostles' doctrine. Pastors were the shepherds of the house. Bishops were the overseers of several houses. Well, what did the bishops do other than that? And while his responsibilities were numerous, his chief responsibility was to ensure that no poor main in his jurisdiction got out of line and taught heresies. He was to be sure that none of his ecclesias, none of his assemblies, none of his poimains got out of order. That's why you see and you grasp and you understand that when one is named and made a bishop, they are to maintain order in the house. The bishop was to make sure that no poimain, please understand that it could be very easily done, very, very simply done, whereas a poimain could get beside himself and, you know, I'm in charge here. I can say what I want to say and do what I want to do and teach what I want to teach. But they did not allow that kind of chaos in that day. The bishop was to make sure that no poimain saw his ecclesia as a brothel and began to act inappropriately with those that were under his shepherding. He was to make sure that little boys were safe around the poimain. He was to make sure that little girls, if they wanted to go and have a sleepover at the poimain's house, then their sleepover would be a safe sleepover. And that bishop was responsible to make sure that those kind of things occurred in that jurisdiction. He was to ensure that the poimain and the deacons were not running some ecclesiastical Ponzi scheme. He was to make sure that the poimain was not abusing his wife all week long and then coming to the ecclesia on Sunday and acting like nothing was going on. But his main responsibility again was to make sure that the poimain was teaching the apostles' doctrine. There were many doctrines floating around during that time. And some of the poimains had fallen into the trap. You know, it's very easy for false teachings and heresies to get in the wind and somebody grab a hold of something that's being taught, and because it sounds good, they run with it. But the bishop had to be informed enough, educated enough, enlightened enough, anointed enough to address the false teaching. He had to be able to recognize that's not what the apostles taught. That's not what we are supposed to teach. That's not what Peter, James, and John told us. And he would bring order to that. Again, they were plagued with the Jewish legalisms and false doctrines of circumcision. But the bishop had to bring that heresy into line. They were Gnostics that were going around saying that the common man could not know God because there was a special knowledge that they had to have in order to know God. But the bishop had to bring order to that. No. Anybody can know God. And there is no special revelation. There are no special people. There are no Gnostics that have some kind of access to God that everybody else does not have. That violated the apostles' doctrine. There was asceticism going around that taught self-abuse made one more godly. There was antinomianism that said that God had saved the spirit, and that was all that he saved, and he left the flesh to do whatever the flesh wanted to do. That was against the apostles' doctrine. The antinomianists were teaching people to eat, drink, and be merry because the only thing God is concerned about is your spirit, not your flesh. Paul had to tell the antinomianists, shall we continue in sin that grace might abound? Antinomianism was against the apostles' doctrine, and anything that the poimains were teaching that was contrary to the apostles' doctrine, it was a job of the bishop to bring that in order. And the worst of all of the false doctrines was Docetism. The Docetists were teaching that Jesus could not be God in the flesh. They said, no way would God wrap himself in flesh and come down to earth. And they were teaching that Jesus could not have been God because God can't be flesh. They denied the incarnation. They said Jesus was not God in the flesh, that he had to be something else. They said flesh was sinful. And if flesh is sinful, Jesus is sinful, and therefore he cannot be God. Their Christology was off. And the bishops had to make sure that if you don't get anything right, poor man, if you err in everything else, poor man, if you don't understand, I mean, you can get it wrong about women wearing dollars on their head. That's all right. But don't get it twisted when it comes to Jesus Christ. It was definitely against the apostles' doctrine to teach anything contrary to what Jesus said about himself. So the bishops ensured that you get it right when it came to Jesus. Get it right that he was born of a virgin. Get it right. And if they denied it and if they didn't get it right, the bishop came in and corrected. Get it right that the blood of Joseph, if he had to do a blood test on the blood of Jesus, and Joseph is declaring that he's the father, the blood test going to come back and say, Joseph, you are not the father. Get it right that he was the Son of God. Get it right that he healed the sick and raised the dead. Get it right that he opened blinded eyes. So it was the job of the bishop to make sure that those who taught their people in their ecclesia got their teachings right. And if it was not right, then the bishop, that's why Bishop Designate Craig Oliver has been chosen from a pool because we are confident that he's educated enough, that he's committed enough, that he's bold enough to say to us when we get it wrong, that's not the apostles' doctrine. The bishop could correct, he could chastise, and even silence the teachings of the poor mains that were under his authority. Now, I'm going to close this particular part of my teaching, and when I come back, I'm going to try to explain, do my very best to explain, why do bishops wear all of these garments? What's all of this attire? And how does that all fit into this whole understanding of what the bishop is supposed to do, why he's supposed to do it, and how his garments represent his role in the Christian church as a bishop in the Lord's church. God bless you. God keep you. I hope that tonight's lesson has been informative, that you would take what I've instructed you on tonight and let this be something that Elizabeth understands. That's why your man of God is now being elevated to the office of the episcopacy. God bless you.
And I pray and trust that you've gained a greater understanding as a result of hearing from the heart of Bishop Jerry Hutchins. He has challenged us to think about this whole aspect as it relates to what it means to serve in the Lord's kingdom, and even beyond that, in this particular case, to serve as a bishop in the Lord's church. And I thank God again for Bishop Jerry Hutchins for educating us, for informing us, for enlightening us as it relates to this whole aspect of leadership. Now, I want to encourage you to be a part of our online Bible study again come next Wednesday, as again Bishop Andy Luder will share with us more insight as it relates to this whole matter of serving as a bishop in the Lord's church. EBC family and friends, I want to personally thank you for taking this journey with me, and you're being open-minded, and even as it relates to you're having an open spirit to receive. And I pray that you've been blessed. Take care. May God bless you until we meet again. Bye-bye.